What's up guys, Phoenix here. This video is going to be another OCG deck profile / discussion video, and this time is going to be covering an Infernoid deck list. This deck list was piloted at the Yokkaichi Cup 3v3 team tournament that took place this past weekend on September 20th, 2015, and overall the team that this deck was piloted on placed 4th place overall. Now, as I said with the previous Monarch list that was put up yesterday on my channel, this deck did have the potential to possibly be carried throughout the tournament because his teammates were piloting. One of them was piloting the Before Mage Performapal deck, and the other teammate was piloting Monarchs. But looking at this deck list and knowing how Infernoids operate in general, I do not really think that this deck was prone to being carried, per se. Now, looking at Infernoid deck lists in the OCG, they're much different from how the TCG operates, but that is strictly due to how the ban list in the OCG differs from the TCG, as well as the card pool difference and the metagame difference overall between the OCG and TCG. Now, the biggest difference obviously being that they have triple Monster Gate and they have card destruction, all of which can be considered win buttons alongside reasoning, even though Monster Gate is typically the better mill card because you do not want to have the variance that reasoning provides. Monster Gate having to tribute a monster is usually not a problem, whereas reasoning, being free, offers that variance that your opponent could call one, and you could hit the Decatron off of the reasoning and thus not get its summon. But overall, I really like this deck list. This deck list is very well put together, it's very well functioning, and the person really seems like he knew what he was going to be dealing with when he decided to put this deck list together for this tournament. So anyway, the deck list was 1 Infernoid Anunku, 1 Infernoid Devyade, 2 copies of Atondel, 3 copies of Seismus, 1 copy of Shete to be the 10th name for Imagination, because he did play it. And if you can get the full 10 name effect off, it's really powerful in terms of what you can do with Tiara. Triple copies of Petrulia, triple copies of Harmadic, 3 copies of Antra, 3 copies of Decatron, and 1 copy of Pyramice, bring the 21 monster count to a close. Now, there's no additional monsters in the deck to assist with the engine. The deck in the OCG does not need it. In the TCG, you obviously have to add some sort of additional things simply to remove the massive amount of variance that Reasoning has, as well as to supplement the fact that we don't have the 2 extra monster gates. But on the bright side, if you wanted to play this deck in ARG format, at the time that this video is being filmed, the current ARG format has 2 copies of Monster Gate and 2 copies of 1-for-1 legal. So while you don't have 3 copies of Monster Gate, you do have a 2nd copy of 1-for-1 to compensate and just increase your access into Infernoid Decatron, which overall might be what the deck needs to get a competitive boost, at least in ARG events. And that actually might end up being significant considering how destroyed Necros are in ARG format currently compared to TCG format. But anyway, spells that this duel is played: 3 copies of Reasoning and 3 copies of Monster Gate. Obviously, Monster Gate is the best card in terms of between Reasoning and Monster Gate because, as I've already stated, it's going to 100% hit its target, whether it be one of your side decked monsters or your Decatron. There's no variance and there's no input from your opponent involved. 1 copy of 1-for-1 to be an additional card to get into Decatron. 1 copy of Card Destruction just to be a hand reset button. Now, this card, if it was legal in the TCG, I believe we would also be playing it in Infernoids, even though we only had 1 Monster Gate, because just the ability to be able to see 4 to 5 new cards for absolutely no reason and dig deeper into your win conditions, being Reasoning, Monster Gate, a lot of Infernoids in grave, being able to load your grave with Infernoids off of this card as well while drawing additional cards. Definitely something that would be a very big asset, kind of like how this card was played in Dragon Ruler format. You wanted to ditch your hand, fuel your grave, and reset your hand and get new cards and get closer to your win conditions at that point. So, overall, I believe that this card is essentially, every time I've played OCG Infernoid decks in OCG format, this card has almost been a pseudo win button. I don't believe I've lost a game anytime that I've drawn or opened Card Destruction and been able to use it and dig further into my Reasonings and Monster Gates and just establish a huge amount of tempo into my win conditions, being my big Infernoids and nonsense like that. But carrying on, 1 copy of Harpy's Feather Duster and 1 copy of Burial from a Different Dimension. 2 copies of Void Vanishment to search out the 1 copy of Void Imagination and the 1 copy of Void Seer, as well as the 1 copy of Void Purification in the trap lineup. The rest of the traps, 3 copies of Mistake, just to deal with all those search heavy decks, because this deck literally doesn't search anything outside of Void Vanishment. and even then, this card has purpose even outside of being a search card, because it turns any of your Infernoids into a pseudo DD Warrior Lady-esque kind of card. But I mean, it's very few and far between where that becomes relevant, but sometimes it very much is. And then One Solemn Warning and One Solemn Judgment round out his main deck. His side deck, the only 3 monsters he sided were cards that he could side in against different matchups and get off of Reasoning and Monster Gate, and that is Thunder King Ryo, The End of Anubis, and Arcelor Christia. All very high impact cards, and they all pretty much come in against different things. Some multiples would come in against the same thing. Essentially, they are side decked cards that will be able to punish your opponent off calling Reasoning wrong, as well as just being able to Monster Gate into them. And they would be very, very crucial and critical to whatever matchup that he was putting them in against. 1 copy of Dark Hole, the 2nd copy of Void Seer, triple Diamond Dust, 2 Breakthrough Skill for, it can be milled, it negates things. I don't need to explain that one. 2 copies of Gozen Match, because everything in his main deck is fire, and 3 copies of Soul Drain. Now, for those of you who are unaware, these cards do not start chains in the graveyard. Devyade, Anuku, Atondal, Seismus, they all just summon themselves. They don't actually start chains. So Soul Drain and Abyss Dweller and cards like that do not actually stop them from being able to summon themselves. So he could side in triple Soul Drain against like BA and still be able to summon all these huge guys. A lot of people that I've been talking to have a misconception on what stops the Infernoids and what does not. These cards are all inherent summons. You cannot chain Max C to them, and they cannot be stopped by Dweller or Soul Drain because they are not effects that are activating. They are summons that are happening, and they are all summons like BLS and Cyber Dragon. It just doesn't matter that they're coming from the graveyard. Basically, think of Grapha, Dragon Lord of Dark World. These are basically more copies of Grapha in the game at the current point in time. But anyway, moving on to the extra deck, 3 copies of Elder Entity Intis, or NTSS, whatever you want to call it. I mean, sometimes I call it Intis because phonetically, that's what's on the screen. But this card, you almost never actually summon it, but if you are able to summon it, like, it does offer its merits, but not really for this specific deck. But you can special summon it by sending a Synchro monster and an Xyz monster that you control to your graveyard, and it can't be special summoned by other ways. You don't use Polymerization. It's basically just a contact fuse. And then once per turn, you can special summon 1 level 4 monster from your hand. So if you do end up summoning this, you can start special summoning like dead Decatrons out of your hand and stuff like that, but you can't summon any of these other guys because they can't be special summoned except by their own effects. So that's an issue. So you almost never summon this card, but the reason this card is played as a 3-of is actually because of Void Imagination, because this card has another very good effect, and that is, if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can target 1 card on the field and destroy it. You can only special summon 1 Elder Entity Intis once per turn, but that's not relevant. The most relevant part of this effect is, if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can target 1 card on the field and destroy it. And what that does is that works in conjunction with Infernoid Tierra, because every time you're going to be summoning Tierra, you're going to have to use 3 or more Infernoids, because that's its requirement. But when you use 3 or more Infernoids, each player sends 3 cards from their extra deck to the graveyard. I wonder what 3 cards you're going to send. So basically, if your opponent has 2 cards, you can send 2 of this and a Tiara, just to be an extra Infernoid name, and pop both their cards. If your opponent has 3 or more cards, send all 3 copies, pop all 3 cards. Seems pretty good, right? It's really, really good. I'm not even going to let you contemplate that one. But Tiara, obviously, 2 copies of it. The reason there are 2 copies is because, as I mentioned before, when you do the Imagination play and your opponent has less than 3 cards, 2 or 1, you're not going to want to send all 3 copies of NTSS, so you'll just send however many copies for how many cards they control, and then the other card you'll send will be a Tiara to be an extra Infernoid name, and then if you still have to send another one, you can send something else. But usually, you're going to be sending 2 of these and 1 Tiara. Typically. But continuing on the Synchros, Gaia Knight, the Force of the Earth, and Scrap Archfiend, just because they're vanillas, you can have these on the board. They will not count towards the level restriction of the Infernoids. 1 High-Speed Droid, Chamber Rider, 1 Odd Eyes Meteor Burst Dragon, 1 Star Spark Dragon, and 1 Psyframe Lord Omega. And this card is really cool in this deck because it clears itself from the board and takes a card out of your opponent's hand. Thus, every turn it can remove itself from the board and then free up all your Infernoid summons and then bring itself back, being an additional big body. And then it can continually put cards that are your banished Infernoids back into the grave to further fuel your Infernoid summons. It's basically a summonable Void Purification for this deck, and it's really cool. It's a really neat thing, and honestly, when this card comes out, I can honestly see 1, maybe 2 copies of it being played in TCG Infernoid deck list, simply because the more of these you have floating, the more longevitous your game state is, and they can keep clearing themselves to disrupt your opponent's hand, and that's really cool and it's really neat. I really like it, specifically in this deck. But for the Exceeds, 1 Dark Rebellion Exceeds Dragon, 1 Odd Eyes Absolute Dragon, 1 Mecha Phantom Beast Dracossack, and 1 Divine Dragon Knight Felgrand brings this deck list to a close. Overall, as I've already stated, if you wanted to play this deck in the TCG, there is definitely relevant information you can dissect from this list, specifically being that, although the formats are completely different and the ban lists are separate between the OCG and the TCG, there is still basically the decks in the OCG are just basically doing exactly what the decks in the TCG are doing right now as well. So you can definitely draw some comparisons from this deck. Like I said, if you wanted to play this deck in ARG format, it would be probably really good because they have 2 copies of Monster Gate and 2 copies of 1-for-1 at this current point in time that this video is being filmed. That may change in the future because they may realize that might have been too powerful for Infernoids to be given in their current format. But who knows? Anyway, as always, guys, thanks for watching. Comment, rate, subscribe, like the video if you like the content I'm producing and like these types of videos specifically. Drop a like down below and show your support. It would definitely let me know that you want to see more of these types of videos in the future. Links are in the description to both my Facebook pages, my fan page, as well as my personal page. If you're looking to either send me a deck list to look at or get some personal one-on-one, just general discussion, you're going to want to go to either of those links and do the appropriate actions with either one. If you're wanting to play me on DN, send me a message. If you see me online, my DN username is in the description, and you see it on all the videos that I play in. Clicking that if you have not, I'd greatly appreciate it. It helps make money, and there's no reason to lie to you guys about that. But as usual, I would not be offended, nor take it personally if you decided not to do so. It would just help me out immensely, and it would be appreciated more than you could ever understand or know if you decided to do so. But that is it for this video. As I said, like this video if you want me to do more types of videos covering this type of content. And as always, guys, take care.